Hello, everyone. This is Sean from the Soccer Nostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview Mr. David Stuart of the Scotland Epistles football magazine. Mr. Stuart is a former fanzine writer and the co-founder of the Scotland Epistles football magazine. And he's the co-author of two books on the Scottish national side, along with Mr. Robert Marshall. Mr. Stewart has appeared before on the podcast discussing the matches of the Scotland national team. For this interview, we take the opportunity to look at the match history between Brazil and Scotland. This interview is separate from a podcast series. This video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog presentation on the head-to-head encounters between Brazil and Scotland. Hello, David. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a while.
The first matches between the nations, Brazil and Scotland, was a friendly on June 25, 1966 at Glasgow that ended as a 1-1 tie. Stephen Chalmers had given Scotland the lead in the 11th minute before Servillo tied the match in the 15th minute. And this was the first match on Scottish soil and at Glasgow's Hampden Park.
I was only 3 at the time, but I have read up on some of it. Obviously, it was a World Cup warm-up for Brazil because the World Cup was just about to start in England, and we all know how that ended. It didn't end too well for Brazil. I think they kind of came up against a lot of rough treatment during the early stages of the World Cup. I also think they came up against some at Hampden as well. There was one or two spicy tackles, shall we say, from both sides. And I think sometimes throughout the whole of this, there's been some games that have been a bit more physical than usual for Brazil, I would say. Scotland lineup, John Prentice was the manager, and this was his fourth game. He'd lost his first 4-3 to England at Hampden the month before, and followed that up with a game against Netherlands. They lost that 3-0 at Hampden. He'd went with an all Scottish-based team. The third match was against Portugal the week before this, and that ended up 1-0 to Portugal. So this match ended at 1 each. So I think there was a bit of relief in some way, that they hadn't gone down to a 4 defeat, particularly at home. But I also think there was a feeling that the Brazilians had held back a bit. I think one of the papers, the Glasgow Herald, had described Scotland as a sparring partner, as opposed to an opposition, shall we say. But the team lineup, you're seeing John Clark of Celtic in there in his first cap, and you're seeing Peter Cormack at Hibernian for his first cap. Neither would have particularly long careers with Scotland. I think Clark is at 5 or 6 caps, and Peter Cormack ended up with about 8. For both players, that was pretty poor. They were both excellent players. Clark obviously was with Celtic for many years to come after this. Cormac went to Liverpool after Nottingham Forest and was part of their UEFA Cup winning side. But overall, it was, with Jimmy Johnson was missing and Dennis Law was missing from the side as well. So it wasn't a full Scottish side, There's one or two players that could have been changed. But they were seen to have done quite well considering the opposition.
Yes, and this was the only time Pele played against Scotland, we should mention. And on the Scotland side, Billy Bremner, he played in this match, and he would be the only one to continue to do so in the matches in the 70s against Brazil, I should say.
Yeah, one of the Glasgow Herald describes some of Bremner's plays, sometimes dishonourable intentions. I think Bremner was a tough player, feisty, shall we say. And, You know, if you look at the highlights of some of the 72 game and the 74 game, you know, there's a few tackles going in both those matches from Bremner, but he's on the end of a few as well.
Well, he would not be Bremner if he was not tough and
No,
battling. Yeah. So,
that was part of his game.
yeah.
As to John Prentice, the manager, he was sacked within a few weeks after this. He had been given an offer over in Vancouver, and he'd went over to see it, and the SFA says, well, if you're not committing to us, then we're not committing to you either. So they sacked him.
We come to the decade of the 70s where the sides met with more frequency. The first match in the 70s was on July 5th, 1972, as part of the tournament, the Brazil Independence Cup. And Brazil defeated Scotland 1-0, with Jairzinho scoring from 10 minutes before the end, actually heading in across from the left side to give Brazil the victory. And they would go on and win this tournament, Brazil.
Yeah, I think that it was on the television. I have obviously looked at it since. I mean, it was a pretty good performance by Scotland. Again, the squad that went to the independence tournaments was depleted. There's quite a few players called off. Dalglish at Celtic was one of the ones that didn't travel. So you've got, a good team though that turned out. You've got Alec Forsyth from Partick Thistle at the time. He was commented as the best Scotland player of the day. And if you watch the YouTube video, you see he's actually quite involved quite heavily. I don't think they had any great chances within the match, but definitely in the reports the next few days, Tommy Docherty, said he was a bit disappointed in the Brazilian tackles as such. Again, it's kind of that feisty nature to it. I don't know if that's a Scotland-Brazil thing, but still, it could be worse. It could be a Scotland-Uruguay thing that never ends well. But no, I mean, the whole tournament was it worked out well for some players. Obviously came into the reckoning for Tommy Docherty. You saw the likes of Jimmy Bowen was picked from Norwich. Forsyth, I've already said. Eddie Colquhoun came into it more. And, it seemed to get a settled sort of lineup for a bit there.
The sides met again in the following year at Glasgow at Hampden Park. This time, Brazil came away with a 1-0 win, the first away win in the series, with an own goal through Derek Johnson in the 33rd minute. What are your memories from this?
Well, this is my first international I ever went to.
So
see
first
Scotland.
ever, right? First ever?
First ever.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. I don't remember too much about it, to be honest. It's Hampden at that point. I mean, it's a big crowd, but the terrace and the North Stand was kind of, well, what is the North Stand now? Was almost on a level with the playing field, so you imagine a 10-year-old boy trying to get and see. So I don't, it was because it was quite in the summer as well. It was a lovely, bright day. But as to the game itself, I don't recall that much. And certainly, newspaper reports seem to indicate, Brazil were way ahead of us in many ways. But again, it was a Brazil that wasn't, trying too hard, it would seem, to win the game. They didn't have to. Somebody put it down at times, an inferiority complex for Scotland. And I think there's a bit of that runs through some of these games at times. When they come up against Brazil, it's kind of, oof. I think there's been a few times where, maybe we just believed ourselves in a wee bit more. you know, if you look at 74 and you look at 90, you know, there's games that were Brazil were there to be had, and maybe they could have done something. I mean, that's one of the things. We've never beaten Brazil. But that game, as I say, Willie Ormond had been in charge for a few months, and it was kind of defeat. He was going through a bad patch as well. But for us, our next game was at home to Czechoslovakia in the World Cup qualifier, and we won that one, and that took us through to the World Cup. Of course, we would draw Brazil.
So the next match was the most high-profile encounter between the nations. And the following year, as you said, on June 18th, 1974, at Frankfurt at Waldstadt in West Germany. And this match would end as a scoreless tie. Scotland held the defending world champions to a draw, but obviously Scotland would be eliminated for not scoring enough goals against Zaire.
Yeah.
But at least in this match, they held their own.
It certainly did. I mean, if you look at the highlights, you see as many chances for Scotland as there was for Brazil. And of course, there's the famous chance that the ball rebounds to Bremner and he just can't get his leg around it and it just slips past the post. And
yes,
it's
a very famous photograph. That's
yes. His hands and his head. And again, it was quite physical. And it was on both sides as well, you know. So, I mean, some pretty tough customers on both sides. The interesting thing about the World Cup squad, I suppose it's a lot of it's filled with Leeds United players. You got David Harvey, you got Billy Bremner, you got Peter Lorimer and Joe Jordan, and they've won the first division that year down in England. Then you've got Jim Holton, Martin Buchan, and Willie Morgan, and they've been relegated for the first division in England that year. So it's quite a strange mix, that the top and the bottom.
The next match between the nations would be in the summer of 1977, when Scotland were on tour of South America, as were many other European nations at the same time. So on June 23rd, 1977, Brazil hosted Scotland at the Maracana, and Brazil would win 2-0, with Zico scoring a free kick in the 70th minute, a sign of the things to come in 1982. And in the 75th minute, Rivellino doubled the lead. Brazil would win 2-0.
I think it's the whole, obviously Alan McLeod's in charge of Scotland at this point, and we've just beaten England at Wembley. We then went to South America. We played Chile. We beat them 4-2. We go on to play Argentina. We draw 1 each with them being given a disputed penalty near the end of the game. And then we moved on to Brazil. I think it was a decent enough performance. I think probably you see the games are after the 70th minute, the heat of Rio in the Maracana. Probably, you know, at the end of a hard season. They've been travelling through South America as well. I think people felt, you know, it's okay, we got beat with Brazil, but we had a good tour, you know, and that kind of bolstered the thinking towards we were going to do so much in Argentina, which, of course, never worked out. But no, it was seen as, you know, quite positive.
As far as the players from Brazil, Jairzinho managed to play 4 times against Scotland, once in 1966 and 3 times in the 70s. And also Emerson, Leao, and Rivellino played all the 4 matches in the 70s against Scotland. As far as the Scottish players, We have Billy Bremner, who played in 1966, and he played 3 times in the 1970s. And
Yep.
the likes of Danny McGrain, Sandy Jardine, and Buchan, and Dalglish, Morgan, they played 3 times against Brazil in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Now we come to the decade of the 1980s, and the sides would meet twice. The first one was again in the World Cup on June 18th, 1982. In fact, exactly 8 years from the 1974 encounter. Brazil faced Scotland at Seville at Benito Villamarin Stadium. Scotland would take the lead through David Narey in the 18th minute with a beautiful long-range shot, but we know the rest. And
Yeah.
Brazil would storm back. One of the best Brazilian sides ever,
Yes, yes. I mean, and that's people, people still talk about, Alan Ruff being at fault, and I can't. I keep looking at these goals and I keep thinking, well, where was he at fault? None of these were stoppable. I think it's one of those things where he just stood still and kind of, over his
Right.
shoulder the ball.
I mean, on Zico's free kick, you
But
can't
no,
really
I
fault
don't.
him. And also, the second goal in the 46th minute was basically near post a header from Oscar, which was such a typical British goal that some observers felt maybe Scotland should have done better.
I think that's it. And then you have to, the
The chip
the
by
one from the
Eder,
edge,
yeah, that's a beautiful goal.
which you'll never see again. That well, you haven't. I don't think we've seen something like that since. From that kind of positioning. Because
Yeah,
Ruff, I think, said at the time, I was getting ready for the cross.
yeah. And the last goal by Falcao just before the end, he basically shot from outside of the box. It hit the
Yeah.
post and went in.
Football by Brazil in the whole of the match, after we scored, it made them angry as such.
Mm.
But no, it was a great side.
Of course, Scotland had defeated New Zealand in their first game. They tied the Soviet Union and once again were eliminated with a goal difference.
Yeah.
5 years later, on May 26, 1987, Scotland at Glasgow at Hampden Park hosts Brazil as part of the Stanley Rouse Cup, which, to remind everyone, after the breakup of the home championship, England and Scotland had decided to keep their yearly encounters. However, after a couple of years, and this was the first one, they decided to have South American guests as part of these matches. And this continued until 1989 before it was disbanded. But on 1987, the first South American guest was Brazil. And for this match, Brazil and England had already tied the first match 1-1, and Scotland and England had played to goalless draw on a few days before this. So for Brazil, this was the decisive match, and they would win 2-0. Rai, the younger brother of Socrates, he scored in the 51st minute, and Valdo in the 60th minute scored the second goal. And Brazil were victorious of this Rouse Cup, and they celebrated by lifting the trophy with exchanged Scottish kits. That remember.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a few photos of that. I think one of the things about the Brazilian lineup is all from Brazilian teams.
Yes. This
Which,
was an experimental side, essentially. It was
yeah,
there's like a couple of maybe one or two veterans, but it was mostly new caps and players who would later become stars on their own right. This was definitely an experimental side that toured Europe in 1987.
I think it was one of those games where Scotland didn't even come close to competing on the same level. I think that Brazil again were always a few steps ahead.
Only 2 encounters in this decade. But now we come to the decade of the 1990s. And The sides would face each other twice and both times in the World Cup finals. The first match was on June 20th, 1990. Brazil faced Scotland at Torino at Stadio delle Alpi. Brazil would win 1-0, with Müller scoring in the 82nd minute. Alemão took a long-range shot from outside of the box, and Leighton could only parry, and Müller just went and scored from the rebound from close range. Scotland were out of the World Cup once again.
Oh, I always think of this game as a game where we never turned up. I think, obviously we'd started with a defeat at the hands of Costa Rica. And then in the Sweden game, we came out fighting, we chased everything, we made lots of chances. And then we came to the Brazil game and it just didn't seem to happen. I don't know. A draw would have been enough to see them through. Did they start to think at some point, well, maybe we'll just go for a draw? Andrew Roxburgh says he never sent them out for a draw, but it just seemed the way the players were playing. It didn't play with much passion or much fire or, drive.
Yeah, neither side did, yeah.
Well, I think that was quite typical of some of the games in that World Cup. I always think it was a poor World Cup in many ways.
Yes.
You're left with what could have been, it's that, played so well against Sweden. Should he have kept the same lineup? Because this is the first game he actually brings in McCoist and Johnson to play together. Because he started McInally and Johnson. Next game it's Johnson and Fleck. You're thinking, well, why have you changed it? I know different oppositions, but when you've won a game the way that they did, you would have thought, no, I would have kept it the same. But it was just in our case, it was not to be, was it?
Next, they met one another 8 years later at the opener for the 1998 World Cup. So on June 10th, 1998, at Saint-Denis at Stade de France, Brazil of Ronaldo faced Scotland. Brazil would win this match 2-1. First, Cesar Sampaio headed Brazil ahead in the 5th minute. Scotland came back and tied the match before halftime in the 38th minute after Kevin Gallagher was fouled by Sampaio himself in the box. John Collins scored from a penalty kick, and this is the last goal Scotland has scored against Brazil to date. And in the second half, Cafu's attempt from close range, it hit Leighton's chest and ricocheted off of Tommy Boyd into his own net. And Brazil won the opener 2-1.
It wasn't. Certainly when the draw was made, it was quite exciting. It was the opening game of the World Cup. It was against Brazil, and Brazil with Ronaldo. It was, certainly, when Brazil scored so early in the game, you were thinking, oh, this is going to be 1982 all over again without us scoring. But Scotland came into the game. They did get back into the game, scored with a penalty. But to be undone with such a poor goal to lose, I don't think, I wouldn't quite blame Leighton the way you maybe think in the 91. It was misfortune, the way it bounced off him. And, it's Tom Boyd as he's coming in. It was just kind of farcical in some ways. In some ways it was, you were quite excited at how well they played on the occasion, because it was a big occasion. Was it reckoned there's a billion people watching it or something like that?
We have to remember at this point, Ronaldo is considered the best player on the planet. There's all the fanfare around him. Naturally, all the spotlight was on this match. We also have to remind the Brazilian manager, Mario Zagallo. He had actually also was a manager in the 1970s. So in the 1974 World Cup, he also managed Brazil. So this was like a gap of 24 years. He was managing Brazil against Scotland. And he also managed the matches in 1972 and 1973. So this was the fourth match he managed against Scotland. Now we come to the very last match between the teams to date. And it's unbelievable, but that it was like more than 12 years ago. So the last match, and
Yeah.
actually the 10th match between the nations, was on March 27th, 2011, played at Arsenal's Emirates Stadium. And this match, Brazil would win 2-0 with their then new star Neymar scoring in the 42nd minute and a penalty kick in the 77th minute. Yeah, I imagine this match doesn't stand out too much in the annals of the matches between the nations.
No, I mean, it was what you would probably consider a pretty poor Scotland team. We were going through a poor run for a number of years at that point. And although of the players that were available, they were probably among the best we had at that time. We just weren't on the same planet, shall we say, as Brazil. Obviously, Neymar, he's a great player, but there's parts to him you just don't like as well, you know. But this game was also marred with the unfortunate event of somebody throwing a banana on the park, and Scotland fans being accused of racism against Neymar. And it turned out it was a German student who threw the banana. But again, it's a game where we were never at the races. Brazil just played about, and I don't think we created much at all.
In closing, on balance, Brazil clearly seems to have the upper hand. How do you regard the history between the two sides?
As I say, I think for most of it is, Brazil were better on so many occasions, a team to be feared. But I still think, in 1974 and the 1990 games, we could have won. I don't think the 74 one, I think they did the best, and they were the very best. I think it was just, maybe something going different, we would have beat them. 1990, I don't think Brazil were at the best and could have been beaten, but as I say, we seem to have froze that night. I don't know why, but there you go.
Yes, I would say you're right. The 74 match is the one that's really more balanced between the sides. 82 is obviously a memorable match, but that's because, again, this is one of the best Brazilian sides ever.
Mhm.
And certainly losing to that team was no shame. The 1990 match is, like you said, neither team was at their best.
Yeah.
And 1998 is memorable for the Ronaldo factor and the fact that it was a World Cup opening match.
Yeah, that's a showpiece game, isn't it, in some ways?
Yeah. It's strange that over a decade, the sides have not played. Obviously, Scotland has struggled in the last couple of decades. Is that perhaps a reason maybe there have not been many opportunities for the sides to meet?
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't think you're going to get many European teams travelling to South America to play. Although we did a few years back, didn't we? Just before the World Cup, we went and played Peru and Mexico. Yeah, I think Brazil see as much a competition at the moment. Probably not. But then again, that they've never played us in a cold, wet November night at Hampden. Because most of these games take place in the summer. Or the last one, they're all June and July, and they're all, well, there's one May as well. But the latest we have ever played in a game is against Brazil. The 5th of July is the latest in any season Scotland have played. So all the games are kind of June, July. So look, as I say, we've never met on a cold, wet November night.
Hopefully in the future, we can witness
Or,
that.
Although we probably have to note that the women's team did beat Brazil 4 years ago, 1-0 in the Pinatar tournament in Murcia, Spain. So the women have got one up in the men.
With that, I would like to thank you for this interview and let everyone know to please read the main blog article as well for more detail. The link is included on the video upload description along with our respective contact information. In addition, on the following day, I will upload the compendium with all the lineups and any available photos and videos from these matches. So, David, thank you once more and hope to continue these discussions on Scottish football history.
Yeah, that's great. Right, thank you very much.
Thank you.